All right, welcome back, everyone. It is 1:15, and I just want to thank so much Sarah Redfield for agreeing to put on this session for us on implicit bias today. For you who don't know Sarah, Sarah's been working in this realm for a long time. She and Judge Donald are sort of a dynamic duo on this subject. They actually co-wrote the book, the ABA book on implicit bias in the judicial system, or how to handle it in the judicial system. So we are so pleased that she was willing to spend an hour with us today and give us this great training. So Sarah, I'm just going to let you take it away.
So thank you, Beth, and thanks to all of you for giving me this great opportunity to talk to you. And thanks also to those of you who did your homework. And if you didn't do your homework, of course, it's not too late to do it after class. So I'm going to begin now with perhaps something you've already done, but we'll just see about that. And that is as soon as I figure out how to advance my slides, I'm going to do that. Okay. So I begin with a land acknowledgement, and I think you are meeting in San Pedro, and I know some of you are elsewhere. So I borrowed this particular land acknowledgement from the University of Southern California, sorry, wrong state, wrong day, I'm sorry, from the University of California, Southern California's land acknowledgement about the native tribes who were before you in the place where you're now meeting. And this would be the place where I'm speaking to you from, which is my home state of Maine, and the ancestral lands of the Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy, known collectively as the Wabanaki people of the Dawnland. Maine is home today for over 8,000 members of these tribes who enrich the life and fabric of all of us in the state of Maine and beyond. So we can talk more if you want about this and why I do this in the question and answer session. This is perhaps a more typical presentation opening. What you're seeing here are the core topics that I anticipate covering in a training. Now, this is not training. Did everybody hear me? I'm saying that again. It's written in my note page in capital letters. This is not training. Okay. This is a quick presentation, what I might call an orientation to the subject of implicit or unintended bias. And to be honest with you all, I really don't like doing these presentations, but I suspect you all know as well as I do that it's hard to say no to Beth. And I wouldn't want to say no to Beth. And I didn't say no to Beth. But I'm admitting to my limitations here. I spent most of my morning deleting my slides, right, in an effort to, that's from my short set, in an effort to make this presentation fit in the time. And that's because there really is so much to talk about and so much, I think, for all of us to learn. So that said, what I'm going to do today is focus particularly on the blocks here that are numbered 1, 2, and 4, but need to say once again that I'm going to talk about becoming aware, understanding the brain science, becoming bias literate, and interrupting those biases. But I know you understand as well as I that understanding micromessaging, learning how to use DEI, how to run inclusive meetings, so all those things are also really important. And even for the ones I'm going to talk about, it will be short. So please save your questions, and I will say now and again, please, anyone who has questions that we don't get to or wants to discuss a point further that I don't get to, you all have my email. some of you have my phone number. Please be free to reach out to me with any further discussion you want to have. The other thing I want to say about presentations and presenting is that I think most of you know that I'm a law professor, and so I'm sort of predisposed to, want to go in order, and I usually have 13 weeks to get done. So I want to lay the foundation about the science and then march through these topics in the order in which you see them. But I learned very quickly in this particular kind of work, nobody else wants to do that but the professor in the room. And everybody wants to, maybe hear the be aware part, and then they want to jump immediately to strategy. Tell us the strategies. Okay, we got it. Tell us the strategies. So I've amended my way somewhat, and you'll see as we go through today's presentation that I have the strategies integrated into what I'm going to say. And also I have sent you just today a list of strategies that I suggest people use when they want to interrupt their biases. And this, I sent it deliberately today because I think people already did their homework and maybe just could use it for reference today and then reflect on it a little bit after the presentation. This is a little shortened view of what I'm going to tell you about strategies. And you know what? It's all you take charge. You decide, you be motivated, and you figure out and learn with me and otherwise how to interrupt your bias. And this is a different view of that with slightly more detail. Again, we are not going to talk about all these things today, but I do want you to know this. There are strategies that work to interrupt bias. They are proven mostly by my academic colleagues in studies, psychologists in studies, and there is evidence that they work. Now, I know there's a lot of talk around how implicit bias training should go the way of diversity training, and we should just get rid of it. I totally disagree with that. I know that this kind of training can work, and so I hope you will listen today, but also ask me for some of the data backing it up if you are thinking about doing this kind of more training, less presentation with your own groups. So that all said is introduction. I have a few opening notes that I'd like people to know. I am not going to read this slide to you. I am going to highlight, though, for you a couple of these points. One is that, and I have that you there because I like to sometimes talk about unintentional bias instead of implicit bias, means the same thing, that it exists and it's pervasive. And I also know that for many folks, it is an uncomfortable topic. I am very used to talking to groups where people come in with their arms crossed, either literally or figuratively, right? And one of my goals in doing this work is to get folks to uncross those arms and to understand that to be human is to have bias, and that if we uncross our arms and accept that, and we're going to talk more about that as we go on, then we can be open to changing it and thus changing the outcomes. And that piece where it says unwittingly perpetuate is the key here. We're all vulnerable to having implicit biases, and we unwittingly perpetuate them, and that's what we don't want to be doing. So that said, we're back to my roadmap slide, and these are the few pieces that I've picked out to try to highlight with you as we go along. I start with the definition just to frame everything we're going to do. And I think you've probably all seen this definition before. Sometimes the scientists refer to implicit and explicit as system 1 and system 2 thinking. So if you see those terms in your reading, you'll understand what the differences are. Now, I'm going to try to do a little exercise with you, and I hope some, if not all of you, will unmute your microphones and answer me, okay? So, what kind of bias is this? Implicit or explicit? The police in Miami had play a game of Monopoly where every square says go directly to jail. This is true. I don't have to make any examples up for this presentation, right? This is a true story. So what kind of bias is that? Somebody?
Explicit.
Absolutely. Thank you. Right. Now let's try another one. This is one of many, 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 many studies. They're called audit studies, where scientists and researchers send out the exact same something to people and change just one thing. In this study, it was changing the names Emily and Greg to Lakeisha and Jamal to try to see who would be likely to get callbacks in interviews. And the question is, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? The answer is yes. What kind of bias would be shown in that?
Implicit.
Yeah, implicit. You know, I'm sure if we asked pretty much any of those employers that were in the test, or if we read their advertisement, which said, we are an equal opportunity employer, they would have said, of course, they were not discriminating and would not. But the numbers will show something different. And these studies continue to, this is an older study in this category, but they continue right up till the present. And Jennifer just doesn't hold a chance. And I'm forgetting the guy's name that was in that study, but I think it was James. Anyway, James is going to get hired more. He's going to get paid more. He's going to get mentored more. And the people who look at his application are going to think he's more competent than Jennifer, when the only difference between the two of them is a first name. So implicit, though, implicit. Now, how about this one? You see a young person in a wheelchair and you just start to talk louder to him. How about that? So while you're thinking, let me tell you, this comes from my own life experience of having a son in a wheelchair for several years. And inevitably, people would come up to us who didn't know us and would yell. And my daughter, 7 years younger than my son, would be pulling on my arms saying, why are they yelling at Alex? And I didn't quite get it, but now I get it. And that is because they implicitly think that if you have one handicap, you have others. So there you have it, implicit bias. So there are lots of these biases and lots more than I have time to do on this slide. The one that I didn't put on here, but I will mention at least in the two that I'll mention in passing are socioeconomic bias and also status bias. So they're sort of sides of us, two sides maybe of a similar coin. I want to do one little bit more exercise with you on this point. So I'd like you all mentally to picture a criminal. Got your picture? Okay. Does it look like this guy? Some of you are smiling. So some of you recognize him perhaps from the press. This is Brock Turner, the swimmer in California who was prosecuted for raping I think it was two unconscious classmates, and that's one possible picture of a criminal. How about this fellow? Did some of you picture this guy or somebody who looked like this guy? So this is Corey Beatty, who was a Black star football player, not a star swimmer, in similar circumstances. And just before we go by this, for those of you who may not remember these cases, Brock Turner was convicted of sexual assault, sentenced to 6 months in prison, was out after 3 months. Corey Beatty, the Black defendant, was convicted and sentenced to 15 to 25 years. So that sort of fits in the manifestation part of this conversation. Okay, this is an easy one. It's a giveaway. Picture a star singer. You got this one? So if you did your homework, you knew which star singer I was going to choose. So we all have different pictures of star singers. I suspect that the judges in this contest did not have Susan Boyle as their picture of a star singer when she appeared. And why would they, after all? Because she's a frumpy woman, and she later told us that she suffered from a mental disability. So that wasn't their picture of a star singer. And I hope some of you did your homework and watched this. Anybody want to say anything about it before I go on? Okay, so what you saw, right, was people coming in. If we'd asked Simon and the other judges, are you biased against women, frumpy women, let's just leave it at that, he would have said, oh no. And if we'd asked him if he were biased against individuals with disabilities, he would have said, oh, of course not. And we saw it, right? We saw how he looked at her, how he responded to her, until what? Until she started to sing. And then we saw him change. And I like to use this example because it's a little out of our usual realm, right? It's judges, but not our kind of judges. So again, more background for you. So I'm coming,
Sarah,
yeah.
this is Beth. I just wanted, because I wasn't quick enough on my unmute when you asked for a response. I just wanted to say I appreciated you putting that in our pre-work, because although I had seen it, I hadn't thought of it previously as an example of implicit bias, but it really was, and it was even more moving to think of it in that way. So thank you for including that.
Oh, I'm glad. I love to show it. And I will say when Judge Donald and I do this presentation live in the good old days and perhaps in our future soon, we start with that video often. Before, we don't even let anybody introduce us. We just play that video, and people are just, they don't know what to make of the fact we're playing that video, and then they get it. It's an epiphany. So thank you.
Can I just ask one? On the criminal one, it seems to me that since Donald Trump and January 6th, that a lot more people envision a white person. I know I do.
Yeah. Good pointer. Thank you. Good to see you. I agree. And I think we're going to get to this shortly when we talk about the media, but let me say now that the more pictures we see like that, the more we are absorbing that, the more some of us who perhaps didn't before think of Brock Turner as our criminal will. I think that's a great point. Thank you. So I'm coming back a little bit to the definition of implicit bias. This is sort of the piece of the definition that I think is probably hardest for lawyers to get. And perhaps the most important thing I have to either tell you or remind you of in this presentation, that the identifying feature of this is that it's not introspectively known to us. So we hold these biases and we don't necessarily know we hold them. And we hold them and we may affirmatively, honestly disagree with them. So if you ask me if I am biased in favor or against, let's just say against women with careers as compared to women with families, I am going to tell you that I am biased for women with careers. I mean, I am one, I've been one, everyone I know is, you get the idea, right? But when I took the implicit association test, which we're going to get to, and I know some of you did as homework, guess what? When I got to my little results at the end, the little result was you show a slight bias in favor of women with families. Now, don't get me wrong. I am totally pro my family. You got that, right? But I was surprised by that result. And it is the proof to me of possessing an association with which I actively and honestly disagree. And what I'm going to just take another second on this and say this for any of you who were perhaps surprised by your results or made uncomfortable on your results. That's just it. All it is an awareness builder. It's just a cue for you to think about whether you might possess an association with which you actively and honestly disagree. The way I used it, I went to class after I did it, and I had my research assistant count who I called on first. So are you ready for the news? What do you think I did? I called on those guys first, the young men who were sitting right in front of me. And my research assistant, she counts well, So what did I do? I changed my way. I counted to 2 or 3 in my mind before I called on anyone. And I waited for more hands to come up. So it's an awareness builder so that if you want to intervene and change things, you can. That said, I'm going to just quickly mention to you, there are lots of sources for these biases, and Drew already brought an important one out and modified it some for us, or grew it some for us. But we get this from our experience, our culture, environment, from trauma, from media, and the marketing. And we are surrounded by messages all the time. And I'm going to focus for our purposes today on the media and marketing, and Drew's already, thank you, started us on this. This is the iconic media story, right? These are pictures from after Katrina, where the young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting the grocery store, and the two, might I add, white young residents walk through the New Orleans floodwaters after finding groceries. So how do we get to this picture? How do we get to those captions? Well, the people who wrote them and published them, they already had absorbed some of the biases we're talking about, and then they published it and made it so the rest of us could reabsorb them. So it's a self-perpetuating and sort of contagious way that bias is absorbed by us. And I will say that this is the reason why you see in my strategies that it says interrupt bias. So when I first started doing this work, I used to, as did others, say de-bias, right? No more, I don't say that anymore because I feel like it's impossible. So many sources bombarding us literally from birth. This is a small, joyous aside. I have a 2-year-old granddaughter. And so I've become aware of the from birth part, right? How early it is that we start getting these messages and how they impact us. And so de-bias is not probably going to happen, but interrupt, I feel confident can. So this is one of my first strategies. I hope all of you do this. It's a little bit of fun. Hold a media contest for yourself. See what you see that gives you a message one way or the other. You probably all recognize this picture from the Rittenhouse trial. It made a lot of press. But what do we see in it? Well, I have to say that judge is not afraid of that defendant, right? That judge is sort of sitting with that defendant, looking at some evidence. A lot of my colleagues who are criminal lawyers say they wanted their clients in that picture, right? So you get the idea. There are lots of examples. Please feel free to share them with me. I'd love to see what you come up with. So that all said, I want to do one more exercise with you. And to do this, I'm asking, please, would you all unmute your microphones? I know it's called a test, but really there are no grades. It's okay. You ready? Okay, we're going to get going. So I'm going to give you the directions, which are images or words. For those of you who've done it before, please do it again. The images or words are going to appear, and your job is to state the color. See that word color written in lots of colors as fast as you can. Color is the operative piece of these directions. Okay, you ready? And we're going to go fast. You should go as fast as you can. Everybody's ready? Here we go. State the colors as fast as you can. Red,
yellow, green,
purple.
yellow,
red,
green.
Okay, good job. You and my 2-year-old granddaughter can all do your colors. Very good, very good. Okay, we're going to do it again. Okay, go. Red,
Yellow, green, purple. Yellow,
Red, green, purple, blue.
Also, very good job. You can all also read your colors. Now we're going to do it one more time. Everybody ready? What are you doing? Remember, state the colors.
Blue, yellow, red.
Okay, that's enough. So a couple of you were right on it, but not even those of you who were on it were a little bit slow. Okay, so what is going on here? What is going on here? I know you know your colors and your words. I got that. So your brain can't cope with all this, right? And this is a very, very well-respected, highly used, multi-purpose test called the Stroop test. And what's happening is your brain has one set of messages and then it has another. So when I gave you the color instructions, I was asking you to do something that was incongruent when you got to reading the word red that was written in blue. Otherwise, when it was all congruent, when you were saying red when it was red or the word was red, really simple. But when your brain had to stop that automatic processing and interrupt and have you say something that was incongruent, what happened? I mean, you could still do it, but you slowed down. And I'm just going to say this to you in passing. Even though I've now explained it to you, you won't do much better. But if I had showed you those words in another language, not a language you speak, you wouldn't have had any trouble at all. So your brain is working in, as my kids call it, American, speak American, right? But your brain is working in one language with your colors that you know, and it can't automatically make the connection. So this is how the IAT works for those of you who took it, right? It's asking you to make quick associations. Some of them are congruent for you and some of them are not. And for those that are not most comfortable, they're not salt, pepper, right? They're not day, night, those that are not really quick for you, then it takes you longer. That's all it is. You're slower. It's not that you can't do it, but you're slower, and slower in in tiny amounts that only the computer can measure. But that's what adds up to give you your score at the end. So Stroop is the IAT in a sort of much more, I don't know, useful way, perhaps. So we've been talking about this indirectly until now, and I want to focus directly on this brain piece. So it's all about shortcuts. It's all about how quickly you can make connections. And obviously, this is a simplified version of how your brain works. And on one side is the amygdala, which I think we all know is the fight or flight response, right? And on the other, again, simplified, is your prefrontal cortex, which is more reflective, system 2, if you will, the way we talked about it before. And that's the part of your brain that's going to focus on things and make a more conscious, intentional decision. So our brains work with shortcuts all the time. We have schema in our brains. We have schema for a lot of things. You knew what your chair was. You didn't have to think it through. You know how to tie your shoes. You don't think that through. You know how to order food. You don't think that through. Your brain has a lot of shortcuts, right? And here are the shortcuts for people, right? Your brain has shortcuts for this. So when you first saw me, for those of you who didn't know me, you immediately processed my gender, my age, maybe my social class, that you can't really see. I do have my suit coat on. So maybe something else about me, not my height because I'm sitting down. You immediately processed that. You didn't take any conscious effort to think about me. Now, you might be wrong. You might have processed my voice. You might be wrong. You might be right. But it was quick, right? And that's what your brain is doing. So you do this, you develop what some people would call muscle memory. This is my drive home, right? I make this drive all the time. I don't think about it one iota. I know to turn right at the end of that bridge, right? So that's all well and good until what? Until one of the lanes is closed, who knows? Until I have to interrupt that schema that my brain has. So let me not go by this before I tell you why we have all these schema. We have them because our brains receive 11 million, this is what the scientists say, I can't even imagine these numbers, bits of information a second. And we process consciously only 40. So what? So we have to categorize, and we do, our brains categorize, and most information goes directly through our amygdala. We don't bring it forward to our prefrontal cortex, and that's where the problems are going to arise for us. So the way that shortcutting works is also, one way it works is priming. I know you all know the word prime. So if you come into your office and you see one of these signs and you're asked to leave money for coffee, those signs are, you're reading them, but they're priming you, right? So some scientists decided to study whether you would do the same thing when the sign was flowers as you would when the sign was eyes. And guess what? You won't. When the sign is just a poster, when the sign is for eyes, you're going to leave more money more often. So what is this about? I love to show this slide. Judge Donald doesn't like to show it anymore, but I still love to show it because look, it's a piece of paper on the wall. There's nobody in the room watching if I leave my dollar for coffee, but my brain is processing those eyes differently than is processing that picture of flowers. So priming, so to me, this slide says, don't underestimate priming, right? Don't underestimate that. And here I want to put this in a little bit more context for you. Once we're primed, we also don't forget easily. So this is an example from some work that our colleague Jeff Klinsky and his colleagues did with judges, where they show a group of judges inadmissible evidence in a sexual assault case. So it was evidence about the victim's sexual history, and it was pretty damning evidence. And they show some judges the evidence, they don't show others. And then their question is, will the judges who know full well that this is inadmissible evidence be able to ignore the inadmissible testimony? And well, the answer is no. Many of them will not, because the conviction rate is different for those who saw that evidence and those who didn't. So when I think about this, I also think about, though it doesn't quite fit in this presentation, I want to mention it, all the times we ask jurors whether they'll be able to decide fairly right after they've told us something that might make us question whether they're biased. So just food for thought. These things are with us in our brains without our awareness, and they're hard to break. So here's a quick set of strategies. And again, in real training, we spend a lot of time on them with samples of them and how to use them. But here's the gist of it. Stop your amygdala from being hijacked. And that's what scientists call it. Stop that hijack. Don't fall into stereotypes. Stay focused even a little bit longer. Take a second to ask yourself how sure you are. Do you like Coke better than Pepsi? How many of you, you don't have to answer this, but some of you at least will say, yeah, I never drink one or the other. So when scientists study this, you know what they find out? In blind taste tests, you all don't know the difference. So ask yourself how sure you are. Then that's activating your prefrontal cortex. Ask yourself if you have a diverse view. I heard when I signed on to your meeting a little bit earlier, you're talking about the definition of diversity. So my definition of diversity is really broad. It's way beyond people. It's diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, right? So ask yourself if you have a diverse presence when you're making a meaningful decision, and talk to yourself. Now that you know that you might be biased, say to yourself, well, the judge says to him or herself, well, I might not really be able to forget that. I'm going to not pay attention to that. Make these kinds of things salient. And I guess, and again, there's a lot of research on how these things work for us. And okay. So I'm moving on to my next topic, which is that I want to share with you in our bit of time here, and that is becoming bias literate. Reminding you that the last topic was short shrift on a lot of points, right? So I have come to think about the many biases, and you see the little image of the handout that I sent you. There are 24 biases listed on that, and there are many, 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 many more that have names. And I think it's valuable to give them names because it helps us think about how we're going to deal with them. But I've sort of narrowed down what I think of as the big four biases for lawyers and judges to these, the ones that I think are most important for us to be thinking about. And I know that people tend to think of implicit bias as starting with race, but as a people group set of biases, and it is. But for me, I think as lawyers, we should think about confirmation bias, which may or may not cross over with other biases like affinity or group bias, but that we should be thinking about confirmation bias as really the most significant one for us. I hope some of you went and did the puzzle for the New York Times and figured out whether you fell into trying to make things fit your own way before you just let yourself get the easy answer. But anyway, the idea is straightforward. You seek out and assign more weight to evidence that confirms your hypothesis and ignore that which doesn't. And there's just one iconic study on this. There are many, but this is one that should be near and dear to our hearts as lawyers, as professors, done by my colleague Erin Reeves, where she asked law partners to review memos written by two associates. It's another kind of audit study. The only difference in the memo was the name, whether it said NYU African American or NYU Caucasian, and look at the difference in the scores. Let me tell you, as somebody who's evaluated often on a 4 or 5 point scale, that 1 point is a big deal, right? So look at these differences and look particularly at the ones that really aren't discretionary. I mean, spelling errors, right? I mean, those are pretty clear most of the time. And then you might also want to look at the general comment. Can't believe went to NYU compared to good writer with potential. Those are some significant difference triggered, as Dr. Reeves would say, by people's confirmation bias. They expected that African American writers would be not such good writers as the white associate writers. And then they saw what they expected. So that one crosses right over into affinity bias. I prefer and am most comfortable, and this is, this is usually, I usually prefer and am most comfortable with people like me. And this one is one that is true for all of us. We all come from cultural groups. We're comfortable with our cultural groups. Sometimes when I do this presentation, I ask if there are any women in the audience who went to Mount Holyoke. That's my college. And sometimes somebody did. And if not, I ask, did anybody go to a women's college? But sometimes somebody answers that and they say, oh, well, I love you. Well, everybody else in the room who didn't do that has to be saying, oh, boy, we're not going to do very well in this class, right? But that's the kind of thing that sets people off. I could be wrong, but my first instinct is somebody like me. And so again, I'm sneaking a few strategies in here. These are all continuing to engage your prefrontal cortex, individuate, find out something specific about the person. Take a few seconds and ask a question. I always say you can ask people if they like broccoli. I mean, it doesn't matter what the question is, as long as you are taking a step back from that quick, reflexive, immediate response that might be wrong, and watch for your context. These are all things that can help you overcome affinity bias. And again, with more time, we could talk about some of the research that this poster is suggesting, where differentiating people makes a difference. So I sometimes do this as a poll, but our time is kind of limited. So I want you to just think for yourselves whether you think you're less or more biased than the average commissioner, lawyer, a judge, whatever category you fit in. Now, when people are being honest, usually it ends up this poll that people think they are less biased than the average whatever. When professors, excuse me, are asked if they're better teachers than others, 90% of us think we're better than other teachers. So you all know mathematically this can't be true, right? So this is called a blind spot bias. And I left the definition till after you saw the poll, where we don't see our own biases clearly. And there are other examples of this where we fool ourselves about how smart or how unbiased or how much we know. And it's a troubling bias. So the way to deal with this, I love this first one, deflate your ego. This comes from our colleague, Jerry Kang, who is both a psychologist and a lawyer and does a huge amount of training with judges and is very thoughtful on this. And I tried really hard to think of my own words that were as good as this, but I couldn't. So deflate your ego. Just take a step back and ask yourself how sure you are. Ask yourself if you are really better. And think to yourself that you may be trapped in a blind spot. So those are my four major biases, four big biases. And there are also four stressors that I like to talk about. And these are situations where you are far more likely to fall into your bias than you are in other situations where the information is ambiguous, where it's an exercise of your discretion. Okay, am I talking about all lawyers all the time here? Right? All judges all the time, pretty much. Where you're anxious, well, some of us, some of the time anyway, and where you're carrying an undue cognitive load. Yep, all of us pretty much all of the time. And we see this in studies, like it matters whether you appear before the judge before lunch or first thing in the morning. You do better, just in case you want to know, if you appear first than when the panel is getting hungry. So all those kinds of things about people's cognitive loads are things that have an influence about bias that we want to think about as we work through understanding our biases. And this is just, again, an overall quick list of things that can help us interrupt our bias with discretion, interrupt our bias on ambiguity, set some standards, make lists, stick with them. Be sure you're getting all the information, have a diversity of information sources, not just the ones you're used to. And I skipped over, but I'm going to mention here briefly, though, one other bias in my big four, reactive devaluation bias. It's got a big name, right? And what it means is I am biased in favor of information that comes from people I'm in favor of. So it's a combination of infinity and confirmation bias, and it's a really difficult one. It's sometimes referred to as avoid groupthink, which came from the Kennedy Missile Crisis, where the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy is said to have said, "How could we all be so stupid?" Right? And we all know that the people in the room with President Kennedy at that time weren't stupid, but they fell into a group kind of behavior, deferring to the leader and not getting all the necessary information. So again, things to check off for yourselves when you want to be more engaged in interrupting your bias. So that brings me, we're skipping past micro messaging, though I urge you all, if you haven't, to do some training on that, to interrupt. And this is sort of the big picture list that I want to end with. The biggest strategy for interrupting bias, and especially affinity bias, is to seek diverse contact. And just looking at the group that you've assembled for your leadership, I think you guys should be checking that one off. It's really valuable to be working with a diverse group of people. The next one is to stay motivated and try to form new habits. And in real training, I spend a lot of time on how to form habits. I confess to some of my bad habits. I let people, if they want, confess to some of theirs and talk about how difficult it is to change that habitual fall into stereotypes, fall into confirmation bias behavior. I also want to mention before I close the idea that implicit bias is really cumulative, and it grows on itself and it's contagious. So again, you have to be really mindful and watchful. And the next one, keep track. And one way to do this is to spend more than 45 minutes learning these concepts and trying to apply them and talking them through in ways that are going to be meaningful to you and your work. So I'm going to stop there. And move on to the question part, which I think is always the most important part of these presentations.
I have a question, and I always ask it in these kinds of programs, and that is, in my experience of doing this kind of stuff for, 150 years, these kinds of training.
Yeah,
I have often felt, and I still feel, that an awful lot of what is called implicit bias is explicit bias, and I often think also that it sort of makes people who are very biased, say with respect to race and gender, for example, it makes them feel, well, it's okay because it's unconscious, so I'm not a bad person, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But in fact, if you were to be able to put a probe in their brain, and I know they've done studies like this.
Yeah, they do that.
They
Yeah.
really do think we're inferior. And so I just speaking for women. And so I talked to a managing partner of a huge firm, and I asked him, do you do implicit bias training? He says, oh, absolutely. I said, does it make any difference? He said, not particularly. And then I said, he said, but we don't have to worry about implicit bias here at the firm because we have so much explicit bias here at the firm. And so my question is, how much does it give people a free ride to feel that it's really okay because, they're not conscious?
So there are a lot of pieces to your question. I would say that implicit bias training has value to people who want to be not biased, who want legitimately and are motivated legitimately to proceed in ways that will achieve diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, all those things. For people who don't, for people who are explicitly biased, you're right, implicit bias training, one more thing they had to go to. We can talk about requiring these things later, but if this implicit bias training is for people who are motivated to change, who have articulated beliefs that are non-discriminatory and equitable. And for some reason, that hasn't been accomplished. So my own background is that I taught education law. And in that context, I did work as a lot of work on diversity in the legal profession, which I don't have to tell anyone in this group is not all that great and hasn't been all that great. And doesn't change all that much, right? So from there, I went to doing a lot of work on diversity in the pipeline to the profession, right? And then I got invited a lot of places. Some of you met me there giving talks about, well, why isn't the profession more diverse and why aren't law school classes more, you get all of that. And even if there are a lot of people, why doesn't it stay that way by the time you get to people's careers later in life? All those questions. And I would talk about my numbers and people would be very interested, right? And then after a while, I read those reports over and over and over, the ABA Miles to Go reports and every other one and all the calls to action, right? Infinite calls to action. This is perhaps part of what you're talking about in your question, right? And I was just frankly depressed and discouraged. And so I would go to these talks and I would say, and so all my fellow lawyers and people interested in justice, I don't think you're telling the truth when you say, you want to have a more diverse profession, because if you were, and we're the most powerful profession in the world, just ask us, then gee whiz, we would be a more diverse profession. So, I got fewer invitations, true. But often, the person next to me on the panel or in the next session would say, well, I have to say I agree with Sarah. So this is a long answer to your question, but I think it makes my point, and you get a little more background about how people come to this work. So I remained depressed, right, and discouraged until I got introduced to the work with Judge Jones and some other judges through the section on litigation on implicit bias. And then I could look at my colleagues who, for the most part, if not the whole part, I believe are committed to a more diverse profession and to more equity and more inclusion. I could look at them and say, well, you're not achieving it because your brain is stopping you, because you don't understand the huge amount of implicit bias that is making you behave in ways that you do not articulate as ways you believe. It's those people that implicit bias training can help. Those people who are explicitly biased, that partner who joked with you, I guess it was sort of a joke, about how they didn't have to talk about implicit bias because they had so much explicit bias. Those people, implicit bias training is not for them. Some other kind of training is for them. The kind that says you're going to get in legal trouble because you do this and such, or you're going to be embarrassed because you do this and such, or you're going to see your name in the front page because you did this and such. That kind of training is for them. So I'm not sure I answered your whole question. It is not a get out of jail free card, or I guess Miami is on my mind now. It's not, to excuse explicit bias. And to the extent it's used by those people, I think the rest of us have to continue to try to find ways to say, no, and to confront explicit bias by its real name. That has to be stopped. But it is of value to people who really are wanting to reach equity and justice and support our system of justice through this kind of work.
Thank you.
So if I didn't answer you, ask me some more.
Good answer. Thank you.
Somebody else? All I see are your static pictures and your names. So somebody else, question? Some of my teaching colleagues, before they start class, they make everyone turn their cameras on. What do you think of that? Okay. Surely, we have a few more minutes.
Well, Sarah, to follow on what you were just saying, sometimes when I do presentations about this, I also make the point that bias is both a noun and a verb, right? And to the extent that you are putting those thoughts into practice, in other words, you're exercising the verb form of the word, it is discrimination. and discrimination is illegal. And so I sort of make that tie-in for the people who are more maybe reluctant to get in there and do the work to remove it from their thoughts, but especially from their actions, right? So
Yeah,
that's another way
that's
to
a
just
good
look at
point.
it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the pieces that I most often talk about that I didn't show today in the interest of time is the manifestation of bias and the manifestation of disproportionality. You know, how do we know implicit bias exists? Well, we always knew it, right? You can go back to Dr. Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark in their test with the dolls. We've known it a long time. We've known it way before that. There's some really interesting old court cases where folks frame the issue as if it were implicit bias. But they don't use those words, obviously, so we know it that way. We know it by the manifestations like the one I just described to you. Well, how is it? How is it that we're not more diverse? We know it because we've now started to measure with the implicit association test. And we know it's because, as I think you just said, we've now started to probe our brains and we can confirm it with physical neuroscience evidence. And so all those disproportions, you have to ask yourself, well, how did we get here? If we are people of good faith making decisions, how is it we got here? And one of the examples I often use is of kids being dismissed from preschool, either suspended or expelled. So think about, these are very little kids, right? These are little kids being sent out of preschool, and they are hugely disproportionate by race. And I don't have my numbers right in front of me, but I'm glad to share them with anyone. So it's something like they're 48, they're 18% or 13% of the population, but Black boys are just suspended or expelled 48% of the time. So think about that, and think about teachers you know. And are we thinking about a teacher who says, I don't like little Black boys? No, we are not. For the most part, I don't think that's what we're thinking. I think we're thinking about teachers who try to do their best and are acting in good faith. So how do we explain that? So I say we explain that, as Beth would have just said, with the verb, right? They're acting in biased ways. And I would say they're acting in good faith. And if we can reach them and show them why and how they're acting that way, that result can change. And I just add on to that this one other piece of research that's I often talk about with that. So these folks at Yale did a nice study, these psychologists at the Yale Child Center, and they asked teachers to look at a video of 4 children, 2 Black, 2 white, 1 boy, 2 boys, 2 girls, and write down when they saw those children engaging in what they described as problematic behavior. So as psychologists, I often wish I'd become a psychologist. I think they have way more fun than lawyers. As they're wont to do, that wasn't what they cared about. They didn't care about problematic behaviors. They were watching the teacher's eye movements, right? And so here's what happened. The teachers were looking far more often at the little, guess what? The little Black boys than the other kids. And actually second came the little white boys. But the other thing you need to know about that research is there were no problematic behaviors. So think about that for a second. If you watch me, please don't take this as an invitation. If you watch me all day, every day, every minute, you are sure to see me do something wrong. But if you're looking over there at that cute little girl, she might do something wrong. Okay, I admit to being one of those kids. You know, I always got the benefit of the doubt, right? So here you have it. I think that we need to get people who in good faith are biased and act in both the noun and the verb to understand the results of that, the manifestations, and then how to change it. And when you look at, sometimes this is shown to you as a iceberg, the image of an iceberg. So all these small biased behaviors, all these negative micro messages under the water, and at the top would be the illegal piece that you just mentioned. But when you study all those ones under the water, they are just as powerfully negative and defeating in terms of achieving DEI as the ones on the top of the iceberg. So you do have to look at it as what you do, what you think. And again, I'm talking about people who want to live up to the people of good faith label.
Right. Thank you. I see Wendy has her hand up.
Thank you. I don't know. Do we have time? I had a response long ago to Drew's comment, but I don't know if we have.
Oh, I think we have 5 more minutes. So talk on.
Okay. So, I was thinking about Drew's comment about how to impact and to facilitate meaningful change in the workplace. So on the one hand, I think the academic studies, we've all done the Harvard test, are very interesting in opening people's eyes. But I think that in my experience, you have to leave people with actionable things that they can,
That's right.
in the workplace. And so on that point, a couple of horrible examples. Whenever I hear somebody compliment an African-American colleague of mine or friend of mine because they're, quote, so articulate. My response is, what did you expect? They're a highly trained lawyer, or they went to such and such a law school. So of course they're articulate. But in my particular race ethnicity, I've had people hesitate when I've been recommended for panels or speaking engagements because they're afraid they won't be able to understand me. And because of my accent. And English is the only language I speak. I'm trying to learn Spanish right now, but for now, English is the only language I speak. But people are hesitant. They're worried they won't understand me. So I wanted to comment that on bias interrupters, the Commission on Women did a study several years ago. And again, you can find their materials. I've been trying to publicize them on bias interrupters, but a couple of real examples. So in an associate evaluation meeting, if somebody were to say, gee, I'm just not so certain about promoting Associate X because they lack leadership capability. The bias interrupter is to go back and say, really, why do you think that? Because this person has led XYZ teams or has chaired such and such committees. So you confront them with the facts, right, that are going to belie their implicit assumption. And another one that can be used very useful. I'll give you an example. When I was the only woman and person of color in my C-suite at a corporation, we were putting together a team of up and coming, our all-star team for a special project that involved international travel. And everybody was supposed to donate their A player. And the men all sat there and thought, we've got a great team. The team was all solely white men. Now we had very few women and very few people of color who would even qualify in my company. But we did have a woman who was an all-star in accounting. And so I said, well, what about Cynthia? And the men looked at me and said, well, she has children. I said, and they said, well, she can't possibly travel. And I said, don't you think we should ask Cynthia? And so they thought, And so the CFO talked to her and she went home and she came back and said, this is such an important opportunity that my mother-in-law and my husband have said they will manage childcare so that I can take on this assignment. But if I had not been in the room to challenge their we would have had a team of all white men on this important assignment. So I think it's important that we all think about what we can do to positively interrupt when we see it happening and affect meaningful change and how people actually make decisions.
So those were, Wendy, thank you. Those were all excellent points. I don't know if in your series you're doing, or maybe you did, I'm not knowing, a session on micromessaging, but that's a place I usually talk about exactly those kind of interrupters that you're raising. And I actually use both those examples that you use. And I think I would say this just sort of give people a little bit positive thing to take away as a strategy. It doesn't, I think Wendy's examples are very good, and she spoke to them from a real position of knowledge of her organization and her colleagues. But it doesn't take all that much for all of us to do some little interrupting, even with less knowledge, right? So we all know that women are far more often interrupted than their male colleagues. We all know this. We know it from the Supreme Court on down. We know this, right? And how is that done? Well, by someone talking louder, longer, shutting you off, saying, well, what she's trying to say is, or I think what she meant was, because she is not able to say it herself. So I'm not saying women are the only ones interrupted, but when you see someone interrupted, it just doesn't take much for any other one of us to say, Oh, could we let Wendy finish? You know, this is not a confrontational interruption. This is a simple one. And so I think if you think, if you're going to do another session, maybe this is a good topic, but even if you think on your own of some situation like that, where really a simple interruption can be very effective, or say, oh, thank you for making that point, Dan, but I think, wasn't that the point that Allie made before? Right? Some, you know, those kinds of simple things can be really effective, and training around them can also be really effective. And you get to see people's eyes, literally. You get to see people get it. And I'll just tell you one quick story that's maybe fun to end on, and maybe Wendy, if you are using it, you can use it in some of the work you do. It's about a couple of lawyers and the male in a firm, and the male lawyer offers to answer the woman's emails for a day, because who knows where she's going to be. But anyway, he's going to answer her emails for the day, and he's not going to sign on as himself, right? He's just going to answer as if he were her. And so he does. And he answers one or two, and he notices that people are emailing him back. Why did you say that? I'm not sure that's right. Did you think about this and such? And he has this epiphany, right? He says, when I send this email with my name, I don't get these kinds of answers, right? So he saw for himself that some of the things about women being leaders, women not being as brilliant, you know, there's a whole bias about brilliance in men. He saw for himself that that's what happened. And so that's the best kind of learning you can hope for, right? When you see for yourself how it's happening. So I'm not sure that's the absolute best note to end on. So ask me one last thing or make one last comment. Somebody.
I have one last comment, and that is there are so many things, so many structural things that are the predicate is supposed to be money. We have to have origination credit, which we know holds women and people of color back more than any other thing in law firms. And they say, well, it's a matter of money. That's the only way we can keep our rainmakers, who happen to all be, you know, white guys.
Just happened that way.
Yeah. And so, I mean, so those kinds of structures, I think, you know, really have to be attacked frontally. And too frequently, I think ABA reports do not directly attack origination credit and other structures like that reflect implicit bias, but are explicitly discriminatory.
Yeah, so maybe I will end on this note. I think too frequently ABA reports and other reports don't have adequate diversity of information and authorship, or at least resource and outreach. And if we think of your example, we would see more diversity in terms of law firm partners, law firm non-part, you know, people in that field participating in the research. If we think more broadly, we can think of some of the reports, one which got criticized highly about women, voices of women in the profession, that didn't include Native American women. So I would end on this note. I think that if we are conscious of diversity in all its meanings, as we do our work, that will help us to do what I think you're suggesting, Drew, and all the questioners suggested this, which will help us to become more diverse and more inclusive and more equitable, because it is a circle. The more women, Wendy, when you were in that room, right, the more of any diverse thought that's in a room, the more likely for diverse and inclusive results to come out in that room. And there's tons of research about the more newcomers, they bring new ideas, the more diverse, they bring more questions. This is true for juries, this is true for meetings, this is true for law firms. So I think that's a good note to end on, for us to think about diversity as we do our work and how to be inclusive as we shape the very work that we're doing.